Hey guys, Metal Jesus here, and I am back with a video that is long overdue. Today I'm going to share with you my entire PlayStation 1 game collection. And I love collecting for this console. I have a little over 230 games for it, and that includes the common games, the really cheap games, rare games, and of course, those hidden gems. We got a lot of ground to cover here. Let's take a look. I'm going to start off with what I consider to be one of the oddities when collecting for the PlayStation 1, and that is these long boxes. There are about 100 of these, I believe, and again, it's really weird because it's very much in the style of, say, the Sega CD, the Sega Saturn. It's just weird that they switched, I don't know, like after a year or so to the normal jewel cases, but these long boxes have become somewhat collectible, or certainly nostalgic for a lot of people. Now, I don't have a ton of them here, and I don't really go out of my way to get them, but I do like them though. I think they're pretty cool. And out of the ones I have, the most collectible one, I believe, is Brain Dead 13. This is kind of a cool game. It's an animated full motion video game, which is basically just a bunch of quick time events. Very similar to what they would have in arcades back in the day, like Dragon's Lair and Space Ace. This game did come out, I believe, on the 3DO. It also came out on MS-DOS, maybe a couple other systems, but it's the long box PlayStation 1 version that is most collectible. It's hard to imagine that the Grand Theft Auto series started as a top-down game around the PlayStation 1 era, and I love this collection right here. It's something you don't see every day. It basically has the first two games with, I believe it's like an expansion pack, but again, pretty cool to have this in the collection. One of the fun things about collecting for the PlayStation 1 is digging into the Japanese imports, of which there are many of them. Now, a lot of these games did come out in the US, however, usually the cover is completely different here, and so every once in a while I will pick up the same game I already own. I'll just get the Japanese import version of it because, yeah, I don't know, it's just kind of fun to collect for, and they're usually not that expensive. Here's one of those games I'm referring to. So this is Omega Boost, and this was developed by the people who went on to make Gran Turismo racing games. However, this is something completely different than that. It is a mecha shooting game, and it is a total hidden gem. If you haven't tried Omega Boost, definitely give it a go. It's definitely got some of the most impressive graphics for the PlayStation 1. Mega Man was well represented on the PlayStation 1. You see the games that I have in my collection here. And the two heavy hitters here are Mega Man Legends 1 and 2. The second game being particularly hard to find, or certainly expensive to buy. Crash Bandicoot got its start on the PlayStation 1, and they just happen to be some of the best games that were made for this console, in my opinion. I still think that Crash Bandicoot 1 and also the third one are kind of some of my go-to PS1 games. If I'm in the mood for, you know, that console and I want to play a great game for it, I'll either put in the original Crash Bandicoot because I know it so well, or the third one because I think that's where it added a bunch of cool stuff. It got everything right. And I'm sure you noticed that I have a lot of these greatest hits version with that green stripe there. I'm like a lot of you, I hate that. It's ugly. I don't know why they chose that, but I also, you know, I don't know. I really collect for the game itself, and so I don't really have to have the black label either. Sports games were well represented on the PlayStation 1, and you see 4 of the Cool Borders games here. I think there are only 4, correct me if I'm wrong. But for me, I always go back to Tony Hawk Pro Skater 2. I think that is an absolute masterpiece of a game. Yeah, the graphics are kind of dated today, obviously, but the gameplay still holds up, man. A lot of cool fighting games came out on the PlayStation 1, and you see the ones I have in my collection here. My two favorites are Bushido Blade 1 and 2. Those are really hardcore fighting games where literally one hit and you can be taken out. And so it's very methodical, it's very strategic. You have to really think and plan when you play those games. When I first got a PlayStation 1, I really got addicted to Fear Effect 1 and 2. These are survival horror games similar to, probably Resident Evil. However, they have a mix of sci-fi in them, kind of cyberpunk, almost Blade Runner. I don't know, I just really dug the characters in this. The story was really interesting, very edgy. And so this is another series that I go back to when I'm in the mood to play, my PlayStation 1. Although going back today, the controls are definitely a little clunky. Takes you about, 10-15 minutes to kind of reacquaint yourself with how these games control. But I still think they're great. And speaking of Resident Evil, it was during this generation where survival horror games really took off. You see a bunch of them here, although I guess probably Medieval is not really considered, survival horror. It's more of a 3D platforming game, but it's got that kind of creepy horror element here, so I wanted to include it with all these others. But it's definitely a fun genre to play in, and I'm really glad that a lot of these games are still loved today. Here's some games I'm putting together because they are all in the first person. A couple of the standouts for me, starting with Forsaken. This is a game that is very much like Descent on the PC, where you're flying around, shooting stuff, has great lighting, really fun gameplay. And then you have Disruptor, which is kind of like a Doom clone, but it was made by Insomniac Games. And so the polish on this is really high, really fun. Not a lot of people know about it. And it was during this generation where car combat games really came into their own, especially because of the popularity of Twisted Metal. And so you see a bunch of them in my collection here, although probably the oddity here, which a lot of people forget about, is Star Wars Demolition. It's funny how Star Wars can be taken and put into so many different genres, and it's actually not a bad game. It's not great, but it's one of those weird oddities. It was during this generation where we got a lot of really great light gun games, and you see a bunch of them here. Now the bummer is it can be really difficult to play these games today because they do require you having an old school CRT television. But I think that the Polymega is going to have a light gun accessory coming out for it soon. So maybe going forward, it'll be a little bit easier to play these on a modern TV. And of all the light gun games in my collection, this is definitely one of my favorites, certainly top 5. And what makes it special is that it mixes in RPG with light gun. And it does it really well. And I don't know of any other light gun game that does that. Most of them are based on an arcade version that they then ported to the consoles. But this is one where they really, I guess, kind of thought about it in a new way, adding that RPG element in there. So it's really great. If you haven't played it, highly recommend it. And if you're going to talk about the PlayStation 1, you have to talk about all of the great RPGs that were released on that system. Here are all of my Final Fantasy games. You have the big 3 right at the top there. You have 7, 8, and 9. Each of them very special and important in their own way. I did a post on social media asking people to choose which one is their favorite, and amazingly, it was all across the board. I mean, you had fans, of course, of the 7, game because that's the iconic one. But then 8 and 9, if you played them, those are also really great games too. I'd love to see them get a remaster in the future. And it'd be no surprise to learn that there are some very collectible RPGs on the PlayStation 1. You see 3 of them here. These games can go for hundreds of dollars if you want to get them complete and in good condition. The good news is that a lot of these can be played digitally, often for less than $10. I always thought it was odd that Diablo got an official release on the PlayStation 1 because in my mind, Diablo is such a PC game, right? Back then, you didn't really think of a console if you wanted to play this. But now this game is kind of collectible on the PlayStation, especially if you have a really good copy of it and it's complete. Here you have Lunar 1 and 2 on the PlayStation 1. These are really special releases. They are really cool because they're by Working Designs, and that publisher added a bunch of really cool extra stuff. They went above and beyond most people. And so because of that, these games are somewhat collectible, and a lot of PS1 collectors want them in their game rooms, and rightfully so. I think at some point it would be fun to do a dedicated Working Designs video for YouTube. Just highlight all of the really cool stuff that they did, the very special releases. They really were an amazing publisher. The 1990s had some great sci-fi shooters, and thankfully the PlayStation 1 got a good number of them. It's going to be no surprise to anybody that, of course, I have a bunch of racing games on the PS1. And while I'm very impressed with Gran Turismo 1 and 2 on the PS1, I rarely go back and play that version of the game. It's so dated. And the same goes for Need for Speed. I would probably go and play the PC versions of those instead of the PS1 games today. However, Wipeout, Jet Moto, and Moto Racer, I think still hold up today and are a lot of fun to still play on the PS1. Those games feel right to me. But that's not all, because when it comes to the PlayStation 1, there were tons of racing games released for that system. And while a lot of these will be very familiar to people, obviously Ridge Racer, maybe Road Rash, but there's also some really great hidden gems on here too, like Roll Cage 2. I don't have a ton of shooters for the PS1, but there are some really good ones, and you see a couple of them here, including a game that, yet again, I always go back and play on the PlayStation 1. I believe it's exclusive to it, and that is Einhander. This game has always been somewhat collectible. I remember I bought this copy for $50 at a time when most PS1 games were not that expensive. Now, that may not seem like a lot today, but it is one of those games where it's really fun, it's beautiful, it's hard as nails, and if you got a PS1 and you like shooting games, you have to have it. It was during this generation where you saw a lot of older game developers and publishers kind of trying to reinvent their old franchises. Missile Command, Kicks, Pong, Asteroids, Miss Pac-Man, you saw them all kind of dipping their toe into that 3D style of gameplay. And some of them are better than others. I mean, they didn't all hit it out of the park, but it is a really cool, kind of interesting time where a lot of those developers were trying to figure out, okay, what do we do next? Here's some games that I'm lumping together as, I guess, platforming games. And I feel there was a lot of creativity at this time where the developers were, some of them were kind of sticking to that 2D style, but then others were really playing with 3D style, which again was pretty fun. And it created games that I think really took chances and, tried new things out. And so some of them succeeded, some of them did not. But as a collector for the PlayStation 1, there are a ton of hidden gems and, kind of lesser known games to dig in and try to find those little gems. Here are some, I guess I'm calling these like third person action adventure games. The most famous being the Tomb Raider series, which a lot of people played for the very first time on a PlayStation console. But I also really dig the Spider-Man game that came out on the PlayStation 1. You have Tenchu, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver, you have the Siphon Filter series, of course, Metal Gear. Gotta talk about Metal Gear, and just so many others. Because I've been collecting so long, I always end up with little oddities in collections like this, and you see a bunch here. These are, I guess, kind of like board game, game show style games, you know, just weird stuff that ends up in my collection. Games based on television shows. You know, when I saw a Teletubbies game, I was like, what the heck? I will never get rid of that. It's so weird. It was during this generation where you started to see a bunch of musician-based games. There was the Aerosmith game, you see the Spice Girls game here, Kiss Pinball. I'm a sucker for all that stuff. I also have a bunch of loose copies of PlayStation 1 games. Actually, PlayStation 1, Dreamcast, Sega CD, I've got all of those in this binder here. This was actually donated to me by a very cool fan of my channel several years ago. Again, some super heavy hitters here. This is a really cool donation, so thank you so much. But it does highlight that, you know, sometimes you can get into these games and just get a loose copy and save yourself a lot of money, and then maybe go back and try to find the manual or, you know, the booklet, and perhaps save yourself a little bit of money, especially as some of these PlayStation 1 games have gotten very expensive. It was also during this generation where you started to see a bunch of demo CDs, and that was a big part of collecting and playing on the original PlayStation, because you would not only get these demo CDs like in magazines and stuff, but some games actually came with them. So you might buy, I forget what games came with the demos, like a lot of Squaresoft stuff did, but just demo CDs are a whole other thing. I don't get deep into them, but I know a lot of collectors, this is like the last mile for them, right? It's the last thing that they'll try to eventually get and acquire. So anyways, guys, that is my PlayStation 1 game collection. And if you couldn't tell, I love collecting for this console. It was an amazing time for just really innovative, amazing games. You know, the PlayStation 1 was a great console, and so many amazing franchises were born from it. And what I like is that, yes, there are expensive games for it, but the vast majority of games for the PlayStation 1 are usually, you know, $10 or $15, sometimes less. And there's a bunch of enjoyment to be had still from that console. You know, it like I said, it's a blast to play. I'll never get rid of it, but yeah, definitely cool to have. So anyways, guys, if there is a PlayStation 1 game that you think I should have in my collection, you're shocked I don't, please let me know down in the comments below. And as always, I want to thank you for watching my channel. Thank you for subscribing, and take care.